Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive with us.
Always exciting.
Yeah. Today, we're going to be looking at something that I think we all are thinking about pretty much all the time.
Oh, yeah.
Have you ever been in that situation, where like you're at a party or something, or even just, standing in line at the store and you see someone that you think, oh, it'd be kind of nice to just chat with them for a minute, but then, something just kind of holds you back.
Yeah, definitely. I know that feeling.
It's like there's this weird awkwardness, right? Like there's some secret handshake to starting conversations that everybody else knows, and I just like miss the memo.
Yeah, you're totally right. It's a really common thing. And a lot more people feel that way than you might think, that like initial, getting over that hurdle of just starting a conversation with someone new can feel like a really big deal.
Totally. And so that's what we're going to kind of deep dive into today because the source material that we're looking at for this is actually a podcast that is all about helping people learn English.
Okay.
Now, you might think at first, what does that have to do with me? I already speak English. I'm not trying to learn it. But the thing is, when you're learning a new language, you're really having to focus on all of those fundamental skills of communication
Yeah,
that maybe those of us who have been speaking the language our whole lives kind of take for granted.
absolutely.
So this podcast is called Learn English Comfortably. And it's got some really interesting strategies that we're going to pull out for how to feel more confident and natural when you are talking to people, whether it's in English or any other language.
Yeah, it's really all about like those fundamental skills that help us connect with other humans.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so let's just jump right into it. Let's say you are in a situation where you want to talk to someone new, but, the classic thing, your mind goes blank. What is the first piece of advice that this podcast that we're looking at offers?
Well, the biggest takeaway that I got for you from the podcast is just try not to overthink it. When you're trying to come up with that first thing to say, just keep it simple and natural.
So I don't need to have like a perfectly rehearsed opening line ready to go.
No, not at all. In fact, the podcast actually specifically advises against that. They say look around you and use whatever's happening in your immediate environment or the situation that you're both in as a natural way to start talking.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. So if you're at a coffee shop, for example,
Yeah.
you could just say something like, oh, that drink looks good. What is it? Or, if you're at a party and you don't know the person, you could say, how do you know the host?
Right.
Something that just very naturally comes from what's already happening around you.
Right. It's like making an observation almost more than like starting a formal conversation.
Exactly. And I think that's part of why it can be so effective for you is because it comes across as genuine and not rehearsed.
Right.
People can usually tell when you're just using some line that you've used a million times before, whereas if you say something that's clearly connected to that specific moment that you're sharing with the other person, it just feels a lot more authentic.
Yeah, it shows that you're actually paying attention to what's going on around you and that you're not just, trying to like force a connection out of thin air.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so you started talking. How do you keep the conversation going?
Well, this is where it goes beyond just the words that you say.
Okay.
The podcast really emphasizes the importance of truly listening
Yeah,
and being genuinely curious about the other person.
right.
It's not just about saying something to get the ball rolling. It's about actually being present in that moment and really wanting to hear what the other person has to say.
Yeah, I mean, I've definitely had conversations where I realized I'm kind of just thinking about what I'm going to say next instead of actually listening to what the other person is saying.
Right. And I think we all do that from time to time. It's natural. But the podcast actually makes a really good point that when you're not truly listening, you can almost kind of tell because the conversation starts to feel a little off or even kind of robotic. It's like there's this lack of that real human connection that happens when you're both really tuned into each other.
So it's less about thinking ahead and more about just reacting in the moment to what the person's saying.
Exactly. And the podcast gives a great example of this. They say, instead of just giving a standard reply, really react to what the other person shares with you. So, for example, if someone tells you they're from New York and you happen to love that city, you could say something like, well, no way you're from New York. I love that city.
Yeah.
It's a genuine reaction to what they've just told you, and it helps to create this much more positive and natural back and forth in the conversation.
Yeah, it makes it feel much more like two humans connecting rather than just, two robots exchanging information.
Right, exactly.
Sure.
Okay, now I know a lot of people listening might be thinking like, okay, this is all well and good for, those people who are just naturally good at conversations, but I'm just not one of those people.
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
What does this podcast have to say to the people who feel that way?
Well, this is where I think the podcast offers a really encouraging message for you. And it's that the ability to have good conversations isn't some natural talent that you either have or you don't. It's a skill.
Okay.
You can learn it and you can get better at it with practice, just like
Mhm.
anything else.
So it's like playing an instrument or something. You're not just born knowing how to play the piano. You have to practice and you have to learn the techniques.
Exactly. In fact, the podcast actually uses a very similar analogy. They compare it to riding a bike. You know,
Right.
nobody's born knowing how to ride a bike perfectly. You might wobble a bit, you might even fall off a few times, but the more you do it, the easier it gets.
And you don't just give up after you fall off the first time.
Exactly. And it's the same thing with conversations. You might have some awkward moments, you might stumble over your words, but the more you practice, the more comfortable you'll become, and the easier it will be to just flow naturally in a conversation.
Okay, that's really reassuring. So it's not about having some, magical personality trait. It's just about putting in the time and the effort to develop the skill.
Exactly. And I think that leads us really nicely into another common challenge, which is how do you keep a conversation going once you've started it? How do you avoid those awkward silences or those moments where you feel like it's just fizzling out?
Right.
And the podcast offers a couple of really practical techniques that you can use for this.
Okay, I'm all ears.
So the first technique is what they call follow-up questions.
Okay.
And the idea here is that when someone gives you a relatively short answer, don't just let the conversation drop there.
Right.
Don't just say, oh, okay, or got it, and then move on. Instead, try to delve a little bit deeper by asking a related question that encourages them to elaborate.
Okay, so like for example,
So, for example, if someone says, oh, I just got back from Italy, instead of just saying, oh, cool, you could ask them something like, what was your favorite part of the trip? Or did you get to try any interesting local dishes?
right.
Something that shows that you're actually interested in hearing more about their experience.
Right. It kind of opens the door for them to tell a story or to share a little bit more about themselves.
Exactly. And that's actually a perfect segue into the second technique that the podcast talks about, which is storytelling.
Okay.
They make the point that when you respond to someone with a story or with a more detailed answer, it tends to be much more engaging for them than if you just give a short, simple answer.
Right.
Think about if someone asks you how your days is going and you just say, fine, it doesn't really give them much to work with.
Right.
But
Yeah.
if you say, oh, it's been pretty good. Actually, I had this really funny thing happen on my way to work this morning, and then you go on to tell a little anecdote,
Right.
it's much more likely to spark a real conversation.
It gives them something to react to.
Exactly. And the podcast explains that when you share a little story like that, it kind of opens a door for the other person to jump in with their own story or to ask you a follow-up question.
Right. It creates this kind of like ping pong effect where the conversation is just bouncing back and forth naturally.
Exactly. And it also makes you more interesting to talk to. People are generally more drawn to people who can tell good stories
Yeah.
and who are willing to share a little bit about themselves.
Right. It makes you seem more human and more relatable.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So we've talked about the techniques, but I think there's a bigger thing that holds a lot of people back from even trying to start conversations in the first place, which is just lack of confidence.
Yeah, absolutely. Confidence is huge. And I think the podcast offers a really helpful way to think about confidence, which is that it's not about the absence of feeling nervous.
Okay.
It's about being willing to try,
Yeah.
even if you feel nervous.
Okay. So I shouldn't wait until I feel like 100% confident before I even try to talk to someone.
No, not at all. In fact, the podcast specifically says that the best way to build confidence is to focus on what they call small wins.
Okay. What does that mean?
So it means starting with those lower pressure interactions that you have throughout your day, like chatting with the person who makes your coffee or the cashier at the grocery store, those brief little moments of connection that don't feel quite as high stakes as trying to strike up a conversation with a complete stranger at a party.
Okay. So kind of like dipping your toe in the water before you jump in the deep end.
Exactly. And the idea is that the more you practice these smaller interactions, the easier it will become to handle those bigger, more intimidating situations.
So it's kind of like building a muscle, the more you use it, the stronger it gets.
Exactly. And the podcast even uses that same analogy to talk about how each positive interaction that you have helps to kind of strengthen your conversational confidence muscle over time.
Okay, so besides just practicing talking to people, what else can I do to, even before I say a single word, to make those interactions more likely to be positive?
Well, the podcast touches on something that's really important, which is body language.
Okay.
And they make the point that how you carry yourself can actually have a huge impact on whether other people are likely to want to talk to you.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. They say things like standing in an open posture, making eye contact, smiling.
Right.
These are all nonverbal cues that signal to other people that you are open and approachable, and they can make a big difference in how people respond to you.
So basically, even before you say anything, your body is already communicating something to the people around you.
Exactly. And the podcast emphasizes the importance of having good posture, a relaxed facial expression, and what they call an open vibe. Just kind of
Okay.
projecting this sense of friendliness and openness to the world.
It's like you're saying I'm open to connection.
Exactly.
Okay, this has been super insightful. As we wrap up, what would you say is the main takeaway that you want our listeners to kind of remember from this deep dive into the world of starting conversations?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway for me is that talking to new people doesn't have to be this big, scary thing. It really is a skill. And like any skill, you can get better at it with practice.
And what are those key things to practice?
So it comes down to a few things. First of all, being willing to put yourself out there and to practice, even if it feels awkward at first.
Right.
Second, cultivating a genuine curiosity about the people that you meet and really listening to what they have to say.
Okay.
And third, keeping the conversation flowing naturally by asking follow-up questions and by sharing your own stories and experiences.
Right. So it's not just about asking questions. It's about kind of offering something in return.
Exactly. You want to create this kind of like a balance back and forth where both people feel like they're contributing to the conversation.
So what's the kind of final encouragement, the call to action for our listeners today?
My encouragement to you is to try putting some of these techniques into practice this week. Pick a low-pressure situation. Maybe it's talking to the barista at your favorite coffee shop. Or maybe it's chatting with a neighbor that you see out walking their dog.
Right.
And just starting a conversation. Using some of these ideas, you might be surprised at how well it goes and how much you enjoy it.
Absolutely. And you know what? Maybe even take a moment right now and think about what small conversational win you might aim for first?
Yeah.
Could it be as simple as asking someone for the time and then making a brief comment about the weather or complimenting someone on their outfit?
Right.
Those small little interactions can actually make a big difference in how you feel about yourself and how comfortable you are talking to people.
Absolutely. And who
Yeah.
knows, you might even make a new friend.
Exactly. Well, thanks for this deep dive. I feel much more equipped now to handle those first few moments of talking to someone new.
My pleasure. I'm glad we could help.
And for our listeners out there, we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
See you then.